Hello, and welcome to this event on how well government evidence served society during the COVID pandemic. My name's Tom Sass. I'm an Associate Director here at IFG, and I lead our work on policymaking. So COVID was widely described as one of the biggest crises the world has faced since World War II, but it can feel at the moment, since we've exited lockdown, like we haven't had an awful amount of space to reflect on our COVID experience. We've leapt straight into a fresh crisis over energy prices, inflation, and indeed geopolitics fueled by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And to the extent that people are looking back at those key months in 2020 and 2021, it's mostly poring over some pixelated photos of various actual or alleged parties. So this is obviously not ideal. The public inquiry should provide some space for that sort of reflection when it's allowed to begin its work. It's still due to start that in the spring, but that will take a long time to report, and it clearly can't do that alone. So we're going to need a broad public discussion. Parliament's going to have a key role in that, but so too will civil society. So I'm really delighted that we're hosting this launch of this important report produced by Sense About Science, with whom we at IFG have long collaborated on issues including evidence. It's a really fascinating piece of work based on new survey work and a wide range of testimony from people across the UK in many walks of life. And it focuses in particular on this critical question of the role of evidence and how people engaged with it during the pandemic. So how this is going to work, Tracey Brown, Director at Sense About Science and author of the report, or one of the authors, is going to kick off by presenting the main findings. We're then going to have responses from Greg Clark, who's just arrived, and Paul Wilson. So to introduce them, Greg is Conservative MP for Tunbridge Wells and Chair of the Commons Science and Technology Committee, which along with the Health Committee published its own inquiry into COVID and the handling of COVID last year. Paul is Policy Director at the Federation of Small Business and will be able to tell us all about some of the experiences of many different businesses during the pandemic. We're then going to have lots of time for discussion and questions from you. Those of you watching online can start submitting those questions now. Please do keep those questions very short and upvote those questions that you like. Those in the room, I'll be asking for hands up, and I'll let you know when I'm coming to you. We will also be tweeting the event using the hashtag #WhatCounts. So please do join in with that as well. But Tracey, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much. Thank you also to colleagues at Institute for Government for hosting this, and also for kind of hand-holding us a little bit along the way with your insights into how government really works. The pandemic put three questions to government. What do we need to know? What do we need to do? And what do we need to tell people? And the answer to the first two was, well, a whole lot more than some first thought, and government quickly realised it. They needed to do a lot and to know a lot. And it's now the subject of lesson learning. Everyone's asking about the supply chains of information, learning about what measures can be put in place, crisis management approaches, how people work together, and so on. But the answer to what do we need to tell people was also a lot more than some thought, and this hasn't been addressed. Far from being a nice thing to do in peacetime, as it's often thought, communicating about evidence and about measures, about what government knows, what might change in what it knows, and so on, is the difference between policies doing harm and being effective. It's vital to a crisis, not a nice add-on to managing a crisis. And it's vital to managing complex problems in the future. So that's why we set up the What Counts inquiry, to push now for that kind of reflection. Sense About Science has spent the last 10 years developing initiatives to increase public engagement with the evidence behind policy. We drafted the principles for the treatment of independent science advice, which are now in the Ministerial Code. And with colleagues here at the Institute, we developed the Transparency of Evidence framework that is now reflected in the Treasury Green Book. Throughout the pandemic, we've also experienced at close quarters the frustrations and questions of the communities and sectors we work with all over the UK in their attempts to make sense of evidence. And in fact, at the start of the pandemic, we were Mumsnet's Campaign of the Month, quite coincidentally, and you can imagine how that turns out. in terms of the questions being fired. This is from that perspective that we were very concerned that there appeared to be a step backwards from the transparency around evidence in policymaking at precisely the time when people needed it most, that there was a reticence to tell people what was known and what might change. And in short, to an extent, policy development became a bit of an us and them, with the us being, frenetic, generating 157 policies in April 2020, 62 in May around the pandemic. There was an us going on, and then, a them. And the them, though, were being asked to implement extensive changes, take on costs, protect people, and cause harm to people, in fact, by withdrawing services and closing down jobs and so on. A lot was being asked of the them, but they were seen as, communicating with the them was seen as a kind of a pain in the neck thing that you kind of had to do on some occasions, I think, but certainly was not central to a lot of the thinking. Slogans such as stay at home saves lives, hands face space, the rule of 6, 2-meter rule, didn't enable the kind of judgments that people had to make. And we've been talking to people a lot about those judgments for our inquiry. So what we did was we ran a nationwide survey in autumn last year in partnership with NatCen Social Research to find out how the public in the UK interacted with COVID-19 policy evidence. And a report to that is an appendix online to the report. It's discussed in section 1. We had interviews and submissions from people providing facilities and services around the UK who were faced with decisions about risks and trade-offs in their settings and communities, from education to transport, and these are discussed in the report. Interviews with researchers and specialists about how evidence was sought and provided, and an overview of the transparency of evidence which was undertaken with colleagues here at the Institute, and that's also appended. We also had discussions with government advisors, officials and politicians about their experience of the development of the evidence base and the challenges of communicating that throughout the crisis, trying to, in some cases, to find the time and space to find a website like gov.uk that actually would work for them to upload evidence and share material and so on. So we talked a lot to them. And 3 fundamental questions have arisen, and I'm going to focus on these. Does government seek to enable people with the information it provides? Does it have the tools to generate, assimilate and communicate the evidence in all areas of policy? And what are the value frameworks for weighing up competing risks and making trade-offs? So that's what we have taken attention to. So our findings. First, an obvious one, the COVID-19 pandemic and measures to tackle it brought unprecedented numbers of people into contact with the evidence behind policy. That might seem banal, but it isn't actually a banal point when you think it's the first time ever we've been able to survey at scale what did people make of that experience, of trying to find what they needed to know from government. Their demand for the background to government's decisions, justification for restrictions and new procedures, the data that informed those decisions, statistics that showed whether progress was being made, knowing how much protection measures might offer, those kinds of demands for the background produced a more extensive, diverse and sustained interface between society and government around policy evidence than we've ever seen before. The frequency of, the frequency of accessing government information from our national survey shows also that interaction was pretty sustained. So it wasn't just that initial burst when everyone was at home and exchanging stuff on WhatsApp. Clearly, it wasn't so frenetic after the first 6 months, but it dropped only from 93% of people accessing information on government rules and guidance from 93% once a week or more to 76%. It's not a huge drop. So it was a pretty sustained level of opportunity that government had to talk to people. Those websites that they sought were also revealed some surprises. The Office of National Statistics and what was then the Public Health England data dashboard surprised us enormously that people were actually, we're talking about the wider population survey here, were engaging quite considerably with such data sources. 69% of people told us they got information about the pandemic from government briefings, but just 30% considered these useful. Should government have provided more or less evidence? The only area where more was under 40%, was in cases hospitalisations and deaths. And I think that's testament to the data dashboard, perhaps, that in most cases people felt that government should have provided more evidence. Certainly very few people said at all that government should have provided less. And this is, we're talking about the general population here. But this wasn't just a matter of public consumption of evidence in this general sense of trying to understand what was going on. The crucial point is that people were running services and facilities, big schools, rural bus companies, family crisis centres, fruit packing plants, delivery companies, burial services, football clubs, adoption agencies, cafes, breast cancer screening. They needed to make judgments. People with responsibilities in all sectors found that government's sharing of the evidence it was using was inadequate for making the trade-offs with the other risks they manage. We've characterised the government's communication of evidence as largely authoritarian throughout the report. Simple messages and rules versus perhaps authoritative, and there's other ways of thinking about this, and simple versus complex and so on, but we've used that picture, which I know was discussed by some people in government. Authoritative approach would involve sharing the evidence base, explaining what is unknown and how decisions might change. And there were, of course, many exceptions across government in the way that people sought to explain and share information. Particular individuals stood out in their valiant efforts to make sure that the evidence base came across, particularly notable around vaccination. There were exceptions, but the centralised policy making and communication in a small group, largely around number 10, was predominantly focused on simple messages and rules. And it appeared initially successful. Compliance was high, and that seemed to reinforce the idea that we should keep it all very simple. But of course, it presented problems when rules had to change and the emphasis shifted. It presented even more problems when it became clear that some government advisors couldn't follow those rules too, but that's another story. The awareness of government rules and guidance declined much more than the accessing of information. And there's other evidence that has shown that people's compliance also became more and more difficult for them. So that initial ability to comply perhaps didn't reflect the simplicity of the message, but rather people's willingness to take action in the face of the threat and to wait until such time as they were able to understand it more. But the interesting thing for us is that it initially seemed like that very simple messaging was going well, but of course became very difficult as soon as you had to move away from that, and particularly once we went to that first opening up. And it wasn't just in the wider population that we saw that. People began to find that very difficult to implement through their services and facilities. People were unsure about which measures to stop and which to emphasise. If one slogan replaced another, did that mean that the previous one was wrong, or was this additional information? And during periods of opening up, many organisations felt uneasy with not knowing the degree to which measures such as masks, distancing and ventilation provided protection. They wanted a sense of scale of COVID risks compared to other risks and the relative benefits of measures. For example, they wanted to know if masking actually was of an order of protection that they would take other risks to achieve it. For example, a rural bus driver who's quoted in our report told us about the dilemma of letting a child onto the bus without a mask at an isolated bus stop. Do you leave them alone at that isolated stop to walk along a road without a pavement? Their parents may not have a car to pick them up or may already be at work, or do you let them onto the bus without the mask? Similarly, people were wondering whether 2-metre distancing was something that was absolutely cast iron in terms of transmission of the virus, but it would mean that they had to close down their family crisis centre. So if we could go to 1.5 or 1.8, it could run it. People needed to have a bit more of a nuance about the evidence and so on. There was very high tolerance, though, for the lack of information initially. Everybody told us that we interviewed, everybody told us that they understood, but frustration increasingly as the pandemic wore on and the evidence base was still not forthcoming, particularly in these areas. This may have led people to underestimate the reliability of the evidence that government was using. We see here that government should have more evidence about the effects of the pandemic and measures to combat it. And in some of these areas, perhaps people didn't realise the extent to which the government evidence gathering machine was in action. And there's also a perceived lack, I think, coming from this of understanding, so believed that the government didn't understand the nature of different sectors that had to implement the rules and measures. This is people's belief about whether the government understands the way that households like them and people in their line of work are affected, but also people running organisations began to think that government actually doesn't get what it's like trying to communicate with parents and children about a huge change in policy around the school, that we can't just have an announcement one afternoon and expect the school to be shut the next day and everyone to understand why. The UK was among top countries in the world for monitoring and sharing key statistics about the cases, hospitalisations in particular, and deaths and vaccinations. That we didn't have very much complaint about from people at all. And in fact, the efforts to share those through new platforms and the dashboards was really welcomed. But transparency about policy evidence and reasoning didn't match that kind of sharing and that kind of interaction with the wider community. We sampled policies against the transparency of evidence framework and found that actually the vast majority of them, 90%, were set out without any link whatsoever to the evidence base on which they drew. And we were really surprised to see that, because given the enormous progress that government has made in that kind of better practice over the last 5 years. And 100% by May were not being linked to the evidence base. Largely this was because things were being set out in a press release. And I think it's worth thinking about whether policy development bypassed the usual channels, and that it also seemed to bypass departments a lot more. We think there's perhaps something to be looked at here, in that the knowledge and capacity in departments to understand the impacts of policy and the networks of stakeholders that would be effective and so on, perhaps had some bearing on the lack of evidence that was being marshalled and its application. Governments also at this time was expressing great frustrations about public misinformation, and I find this quite ironic that the Cabinet Office was setting up initiatives to try to combat misinformation and shut it down, chasing down debates on the fringes of society, and yet not responding to the huge numbers of people knocking at the door demanding information that were actually on its doorstep and needing help. Does government have the tools to actually be answering those? Well, I think a good deal, yes. I mean, amazing things were set up to investigate and understand the kind of questions that people had, particularly in the areas of vaccination and treatment, and also eventually in testing. However, the area of other kinds of interventions, it seems less so. We remain to this day a little bit uncertain about rather a lot uncertain about what the different measures might have done, and all the people that had to implement them also remain uncertain. But by and large, government did have actually a very big evidence base in relation to the kinds of questions that people had, but wasn't really sharing it. So you could argue that people should just use their common sense, right? And that, you know, when faced with these trade-offs and so on, and having to sort of weigh up risks in implementing policy, that they should just use their common sense. But actually, no, because what government also didn't share was the framework, the value framework, the ethical framework. How were priorities being set? What were they seeking to optimize? Was it, you know, just case reduction? Was it case reduction, but hopefully not at the expense of a whole year of education, and so on? There was none of that being shared. So without setting out also the purpose of policies, people told us that it was incredibly difficult for them to actually manage the conflicting guidelines that they were being given. Often different organisations telling them to do different things, different professional bodies telling them to do different things. And it was very difficult for them to negotiate a lot of that conflict. And fear of making those choices and getting them wrong, and liability and litigation and so on. So government didn't set out its values and purpose. And without this, it was very difficult to know what people were supposed to achieve. I mean, the established cost-benefit principles of health economics didn't seem to be in play, as we've used QALYs in many other parts, such as NHS treatments. Modelling scenarios didn't actually include things like the harm done by closing schools, so they could never come up with an optimal strategy, or we couldn't see how that might have been weighed. Case management, case reduction might have been weighed against other impacts. The Treasury published nothing at all throughout the whole period. Social services were faced with conflicting rules for dealing with COVID and also the requirement to provide people with essential care. And this resulted in a postcode lottery of outcomes. So it wasn't easy and simple, but people wanted to. And one of the things that came across most strongly for us in all the interviews was just how committed people were in every sector to trying to understand what they could do to help people, the people they employed, the people they served, the facilities they provide, what they could do to implement policy, and yet how frustrating that experience often was. There are lots of areas of learning about crisis management and managing large-scale policy development, the evidence supply chain, monitoring and so forth that effective government needs, and that's going on. I think there's a prior question for government before it looks at some of these things, which is to ask itself whether it seeks to enable people to weigh risks, use judgment, understand the intention of policy and contribute to policy evidence, or are we going to stick with this kind of idea that slogans and messages are what they have when we have a public health issue or any other kind of emergency and hope for the best? So the authoritarian versus the authoritative approach, whilst I think it was a challenge and a tussle within government throughout, and many people, as I say, did very well. SAGE actually applied themselves enormously well to trying to share what evidence they contributed, but remember, SAGE was just one part of the evidence, as they've emphasised to us. There was economic evidence, there was policy advice. These things were not being published, so everything fell to SAGE to explain the policy outcome, and very frequently they were unable to do so. But people did try very hard to do what they could. But I think there needs to be an explicit discussion in government about whether it seeks to enable people. And if the answer is yes, then there are some things that follow to understand and set out the limits of where an authoritarian approach to responding to a crisis might actually work and be useful, and what those limits might be, about not then applying it over a long period of time. Should be looking, we recommend, to build on the success of platforms such as the data dashboards and the awareness from them, and to make gov.uk a much better place to navigate and a tool for those in government who want to share policy material, to take that seriously, because officials told our inquiry it was atrocious, but they've also told that to the Institute for Government in previous investigations here, and to select committees. People have raised that before us. So let's learn from those who did try to guide the public through the changing picture. I think it's time we also looked at whether to apply a transparency standard across all areas of policy, and the Treasury and Cabinet Office should have a look at that and at how to ensure full publication of models used in policy. And we should explore a publicly responsive trials unit to build on the What Works initiative and to respond in real time as people are experiencing their trying to implement policies. Then we should be in a position to actually hear that from them, the questions they've got, and to consider what might be possible to set up as we go. Some things were set up in great ways around the vaccine rollout. For example, the reduction of the Pfizer 12-week wait. That was a 6-to-1 trial that was set up under pressure, but it happened. And there are fantastic opportunities to actually find these things out in real time if we're listening to people. And to understand better how to communicate uncertainty and equip people for change, to map what is known. And I think ultimately to provide the ethical framework where you can't just look to the evidence and the science to answer questions about the choices that have been made. But I think first of all, government needs to ask whether it does seek to enable the kind of people that we spoke to, and we know for the hundreds or so we spoke to, there are many thousands who really did their best to apply policy. And I think now is the time for us to ask the question, what did government communicate and how it might have done it better? Thank you.
Tracey, thank you for that and for producing this report. It really captures what an extraordinary period this was and sets out, many, many thought-provoking questions and suggestions for us to ponder. Greg, I'm going to come to you. Thank you for dashing across
Pleasure.
to join us.
Sorry to be late.
How far does Tracey's report and all of that she's set out chime with your own thinking, your committee's work on this?
Well, it's incredibly valuable to have such a substantial piece of empirical research to inform what is going to be, I think, for many years now, a process of learning lessons from the pandemic. And a number of things strike me. There isn't such a thing, really, as the handling of the pandemic. There were different aspects at certainly different times. There was a dynamic quality. What was acceptable and approved by the public at one point was not at another. When we talk about scientific advice, we bring together all sorts of different strands, from the epidemiology and the public health advice to the research towards a vaccine and to testing methodologies, all of which were actually very different. And considering them all to be scientific advice probably certainly does kind of hide more than it reveals. So I think this will be a very rich source for the lessons that we need to learn. A few things that I would say in response to the report and what Tracey said. The first is to agree completely that it has really not just kind of whetted, but established, I hope, a higher, permanently higher interest on the part of the public in data and scrutiny of scientific advice and the policy that it's based on that. People are not now content simply to regard the advice they're given as coming out of a black box in which they must trust. They're very keen to see the trends. They're very keen to scrutinize the dynamics of the pandemic and ask questions, and there's a real hunger for data. We see this in the number of hits that the dashboard, for example, got throughout the pandemic. And also, if I can be slightly sort of self-referential, into the attention that was paid to the work of select committees such as ours and the Health and Social Care Committee. It hasn't always been the case that hearings of the Science and Technology Committee have been streamed. The main channels on even terrestrial TV have gone live for hours at a time to hearings. But this was the case, and it reflected, I think, which something I think is very encouraging, an interest in serious scrutiny and information. The press conferences, although I was interested in the figure that people didn't necessarily trust the information that was given out, nevertheless they were widely viewed. But I think it exposed some of the constraints that journalists at the press conferences got one question. Sometimes they sneaked in another one, but it was pretty much kind of one question per outlet. In statements in the House of Commons, everyone's seen you get one question and then you sit down. So the opportunity for a forum like a select committee, in which you have 3 hours sustained questioning, is something that obviously it was our duty to engage in. But it was very gratifying just how much engagement that got with the public, and I hope that will continue. I think the second observation I would make, and perhaps it does suggest sort of tempering slightly some of Tracey's criticisms. Not that I don't think they're valid, but I think the context was that this was incredibly hard. Especially in the early parts of the pandemic. No one really knew what was going to happen and what we needed to do. And so the processes of policy making that we should aspire to, and this institute promotes good practice in rooting policy in evidence, having a degree of consultation and exposing that evidence to scrutiny, deliberating before acting, simply weren't available. And I might say for Sense About Science, for Tracey's organisation, but especially for the Institute, there is, I think, perhaps another area of practice of kind of policy making in an emergency, in which the rules, I think, perforce are different from those that take place in peacetime, as it were. But it is very important to learn about them because there will be future emergencies, and you will have to operate in ways other than the settled and best ways of taking decisions. So I think it will be important to learn that. And so evidence-based policy, being a case in point, at the beginning, we have people in this room who were part of the decision-making. If you don't have that evidence, if it takes the evidence some time to gather in and to be analysed, still less peer-reviewed and validated, do you defer taking a decision, or do you act a priori on the basis of what you think would be a reasonable response to what you are picking up? And I think you have to do the latter. And indeed, what we said is in our inquiry, some of the initial commendable determination to be guided by the science actually did introduce some delays while the scientists were able to collect and analyze data. And some of the early approaches on the continent were less grounded in scientific papers, but were a bit more fleet of foot. And the paradox of that is that I think it was done for good and high-minded reasons, but actually led us to be a bit slower than would otherwise be the case. So I think things were hard, but hard situations will arise, and it's useful for policymakers and ministers generally to be guided throughout that. One of the aspects that Tracey quite rightly points to is transparency. And we know that there were concerns. So my committee, when we first started conducting hearings, we had a concern as to whether we would discover things that were so alarming to which there were no answers that actually it would could cause panic in the public if we were exposing the deadliness of the pandemic and as yet policies that hadn't been taken or even proposed that were sufficient to contain it. What were the effects of that? We resolved it very quickly that our duty as a scrutiny committee of Parliament is to expose the evidence, and we drew on as a committee that scrutinises science, the scientific approach, the scientific method of looking to expose and to challenge, and I think that was the right thing, but it no doubt, I know that it gave people pause for thought, and in particular the publication of advice, sage minutes, had the inherited position was that the minutes of SAGE, the scientific advice group in emergencies, which has been convened in multiple emergencies, the minutes were always published at the end of that emergency, partly for that reason, to give people the space to consider information, to give advice without it immediately going into the public domain. We quickly formed the view that we thought it was important for public confidence, not least, to be transparent. And Patrick Vallance, in response to an early recommendation that my committee gave, that the SAGE minutes be published on the way, as it were, not just at the end, was very clear in his agreement with that, and he personally intervened to change the protocols of SAGE so that they were published in real time, and I think that served us well in the end. Other aspects is the choice between, so what Tracey says about do we trust people's instincts or do we have rules? The truth is that this building, this institute, in almost everything it looks at, considers what is the essential choice in public policy. Is it rules or discretion? Whether it's economic policy or whether it's public health interventions. Do you exercise discretion? Do you allow more trust, or do you have very clear rules? And it's not something that will ever have a definitive solution, because rules have rough consequences that can lead to often heartbreaking situations. I look back and think, was it really necessary to apply some of the social distancing rules to things like family funerals, for example? Was the epidemiological consequences of that so marked that we couldn't have exercised some more discretion there? There are lessons to be learned on that. But we do know that it's not always, people's instincts are not always the best guide to behaviour. Some things are counterintuitive. I remember right at the beginning of my time in Parliament, some people might recall that there was a spate of anthrax being mailed, especially in the US Congress, but there was a suggestion that it might be here. And someone threw a missile, I think it was a condom, filled with a white powder from the gallery of the public gallery of the House of Commons. And Tony Blair was Prime Minister. It hit him on the shoulder and scattered. And it turned out to be benign. It was talcum powder or something, but there was the suggestion that it might be anthrax. Immediately, the Speaker suspended the sitting of the House of Commons, the Prime Minister's questions, said everyone had to leave the chamber, evacuated the chamber. It was a human instinct, but experts in this room, greater than I, will say that was probably a disastrous thing to do, if it had been anthrax, to spread it throughout the parliamentary estate and beyond, rather than to lock us all in the chamber to be decontaminated or whatever. So sometimes, actually, the instinctive response may not be right, and I think we do have to weigh that up. In terms of later phases of the pandemic, we went from rules that I think were initially inadequate, and what we found in our inquiry was that the early phase of the pandemic, when we thought that we could almost kind of microscopically control the spread of the pandemic by bringing on first this restriction and then after a week or so the next restriction, wasn't up to the job. So then we went for a more broad spectrum approach. When we came out of it, we came into a very complex set of regional tiers and other rules. They didn't seem to work very well. And what I take from that is it wasn't very clear when we were having differentiated rules who was in charge of making the rules. I remember asking Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty before the committee at a time when children's sport in clubs was forbidden, outdoor sport was forbidden, despite the fact that we knew that there was at that time no known incidents of outdoor transmission of COVID. Why was it the case that sports clubs needed to be banned from allowing children to play? And no one could answer it. Patrick said, well, this is kind of below my pay grade, didn't you say that? But that's a more micro detail. Ministers said, well, we follow scientific advice. And it wasn't clear who was actually responsible for giving that advice. And some of this continues to this day. So one of the things that, certainly the view that I've taken from our evidence sessions on the Science and Technology Committee is that surface transmission of COVID is very much less a risk than airborne transmission. And yet, some of the health and safety guidance on disinfectant disinfecting surfaces. I went to the job centre that serves my constituency. Every time a client came in, they had someone employed who would spray the table and the chair and wipe them down before the next person came. We didn't do it before. There's no significant evidence that that is important for COVID now, and yet there is a person employed to continue to do that. Some environmental costs as well in terms of the chemicals and things used. We found it impossible as a committee to determine who is responsible for standing that advice down. The Health and Safety Executive say it's not them. The Health and Security Agency say it's not them, and yet these practices continue. So I think identifying who decision makers are is important. Yeah. So I think lots to draw on in Tracey's report. We, through the public inquiry and others, I hope we will learn lessons, especially for the more difficult circumstances of taking decisions, which is when you don't have the evidence that you might have at some other time.
Thank you, Greg. Let me bring Paul in. If I could ask you to keep it relatively brief, just because I want to open it up to plenty of questions from the floor as well. But Tracey mentioned many examples there of the sorts of challenges small businesses faced in interpreting this evidence that was coming out of government. I mean, what were the things that you were hearing from your members?
Well, I mean, it's been an incredibly challenging time for small businesses, and I must apologise. No panel discussion about COVID is complete without someone with a spluttery cough, but I can reassure my fellow panel members I suffered with that a month ago and tested regularly as well. So yeah, it's been extraordinarily challenging. You know, FSB tries to provide a voice for 5.5 million small businesses and self-employed. A year ago, I was saying we provide a voice for 5.9 million, so that's 400,000 fewer than we had. That shows how difficult it's been. And I think I very much agree with the points that Greg was making about how difficult this has been. And we're incredibly grateful for the, I guess, financial support that was provided via various schemes at the Treasury. The FSB argued hard for furlough, flexible furlough, self-employed income support. Nonetheless, for some small businesses and some self-employed, they fell between the gaps. Now, FSB's been working on a project of our own with Newcastle University, looking at how businesses interpreted COVID-related regulation. And what we quickly found was that you can't disassociate the regulatory change from the associated advice and guidance that's there. And it's important to remember that when I talk about small businesses, the average FSB member is a micro business, fewer than 10 employees. This isn't a business with a compliance manager who can easily cope with, you know, the biggest load of regulatory change that they will probably ever have to cope with. Nonetheless, they feel an incredible sense of duty to their employees and to their customers and communities as well. So to the question about, you know, how difficult did they find it, I think looking at the safety measures that small businesses had to implement, we know that 35% found it difficult or very difficult to take the actions that they needed to. Now, conversely, of course, that means that 65% didn't, so it's not all bad news, but there's a big chunk who did. And I think one of the things that came out of our research as well was this distinction between what you must do and what you might choose to do was incredibly unclear for small business owners at various times. 22% described it as totally unclear. Add to that the fact that they were worried about enforcement action. So fairly or unfairly, small businesses do worry a lot about regulators and regulatory enforcement action. And when you bring those two things together, a slight lack of clarity about what are the must-dos and a fear about what will happen to do if you don't do enough of the must-dos, that leads to gold plating. You know, over-compliance comes at a cost in terms of worry, and it comes at a cost in terms of time and money as well. So I think thinking about how we apply that in the future, of course things are moving at incredible pace, but the value of being super clear on what that minimum standard is in any future regulatory situation, I think, is incredibly important. And the other thing I'll flag in my initial comments are that a lot of businesses, I think, had difficulties with customers, perhaps, who had a different interpretation of what the rules in place were themselves. You know, take last July, when actually we're moving out of rules or requirements to wear face masks. Pubs were no longer required to be table service only. But actually, a number of small businesses decided, we still want to be table service only for a bit. We still want to have a sign up saying, please, can you wear a mask? And those business owners at times faced what I could only describe as abuse from customers who were saying, no, no, you must not wear a mask now. And I think there was a difficulty in understanding the move from you must doesn't mean that a business who owns the premises can't enforce its own house rules. And FSB had to go really big in our campaigning and our comms. Actually, you need to respect small businesses' house rules. They're trying to keep you as customers safe. They're trying to keep their employees safe. So there's some of the issues, but really fascinating report, and chiming with what we're finalising ourselves.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. I'm going to take questions from the room, and then I'll give Tracey a chance to respond to what Greg and Paul have said. So if anyone with a question wants to put their hand up and say who you are and where you're coming from. No one got a question yet? Okay, Tracey, while they're thinking, I'll give you a chance to respond to what Greg and Paul have just said.
Yeah, I think really all I want to say is that the initial difficulty was so well reflected in what people said to us. And there was so much empathy. I've never actually talked to so many people being sympathetic to government in my whole career. There was amazing empathy, even amongst people that you probably don't imagine voted for this government. There was just a real respect for the position that people, as individuals as well, found themselves in. And that came through. I think what happened was the frustration when things began to move to new phases, and I particularly crescendo of that around the tier stuff, where again it was who's answering to this, and it makes no sense. And that was incredibly, I think that period was pinpointed by many of the people we spoke to as really difficult for them. So yeah, but I do think that's worth recognising, that the restraint that was shown at that time, actually it was shown by the press and the opposition at the same time. I mean, it was just, people were very, very respectful of that difficulty. It's absolutely right that we should be looking for what to do in a crisis. But I think there's still good ways and bad ways of doing that. And the idea that there's something quaint about sharing the evidence with people, which I do think is a view. I know is a view because it's been said to me by people we've interviewed, that they were frustrated at running up against that view in government, that they wanted to put the effort in. And I think it was just sort of false economies of scale, false economies of time, where people thought that somehow we could just backfill this afterwards. And maybe they thought the afterwards was going to be next week or something at that point. And then realised that if only we had shared a bit more of the reasoning and rationale behind what we were doing, it would make complete sense why we're now changing that, or why the focus has moved. But what did certainly happen a bit further into the pandemic is people became quite suspicious then. It wasn't so much they didn't trust the information they were given, but they started to suspect what the motives were. Who's got government's ear then? If I don't see where this has come from, if I look at the information that appears to be the scientific evidence, and then I see the policy and I can't get across from there to there. And actually, SAGE members were finding themselves really, really pressured by the media to bridge that gap. Most of them didn't. Sometimes they did, and I think colleagues of theirs just rather wish they hadn't, because it was really speculation as to how you got from the science advice to the policy that emerged. But I think the other thing I would say is people were also very tolerant of the fact that politics, values, decisions, priorities, a bit of arbitrariness play their role. It wasn't as though people expected this perfect thing to be read off from the evidence. It was really just that they wanted to understand, where did this come from? Was it a kind of expedient decision-making that had gone on, or was it actually based on something really solid?
Can I pick up this issue of the means of communicating evidence? I think Greg mentioned that his committee hearing sessions were sort of box office, and I was certainly locked in viewing them because they were the only place actually where you could see the people who understood the evidence really being questioned in detail on it. I think you didn't necessarily get that in the daily briefings. You did have the SAGE minutes, but often they were a kind of minimum necessary level of transparency, and it was somewhat sort of retroactive process. What do you think is the right way of actually getting this evidence out during a crisis? That's going to work for the government, but actually is going to work for the public, for small businesses, such that they can consume it?
Well, I think SAGE found it really difficult. They weren't set up for it. And actually, just the very fact of putting, Greg's already said they were placed where the minutes, it was a repository for minutes, basically. If you looked at the front pages of some of the subcommittees, there was been nothing on there for 2 years or something before, in those early months. So, but they very quickly scrambled. I mean, they did work some late nights to try and get the stuff up, but it wasn't very the system wasn't very forgiving for that. So just in practical terms, I think the government does not have a system for communicating with people in a crisis. It is not a platform that people can navigate. Even those of us who are a bit wonkish about our understanding of government found it difficult, right? And that goes for everyone I've spoken to at this institute, and we've all found it difficult. My goodness, what must it be like for everybody else? And I'm just amazed that people found what they did. In fact, a lot of what people found was through Twitter and social media, you know, and the fantastic actuaries and others, and some of the people working at UKHSA and ONS who took it on themselves to mediate. And that became the platform. But the government's platforms itself were so I don't normally blame the means, not the the content, but actually I think the means were terrible. And let's not put too much on Sage. There are other types of advice, economic advice and so on, that would have been very useful, and the Treasury kept a very low profile in all of that.
Paul, you wanted to come back on that?
Yeah, just to add to that. So one of the things we asked small businesses about was where they went for their information at various times. And what was, I guess, maybe slightly surprising was the number of sources of information that each business did tend to go to. You know, the vast majority went to several sources of information. We tend to think businesses just want a single source of the truth, one-stop shop, they go to gov.uk or wherever, but that wasn't the case. And I think that was partly because they wanted reassurance, and it's partly because every small business is markedly different, and they want something that really speaks to them. So they found, and I would say this, that coming to the FSB was helpful in putting it into the language of small business, but similarly, they wanted to go to their sector-specific regulator, perhaps, to understand what it meant for their particular area of work. And I think what that shows is that where possible into the future, whether we're talking about a crisis or whether we're talking about communicating something over a slightly more relaxed timescale, think about the intermediaries that you need to go through, to whom the people you ultimately want to reach will go to for information. So I don't think it's just about where you get the minutes out, because from a small business perspective, they're never going to go looking for them. It's about what you get out through those intermediaries and how early can you engage with them.
Let me come to some questions from the room. We had the lady here and then the gentleman at the back. If you could keep them short, please. Yeah,
I'm Jo Chataway from the International Public Policy Observatory at UCL. I just wondered whether you thought it would be a useful thing to try and devise a framework to signal the type of evidence that is informing policy and the levels of certainty in that evidence. Would that free up communication?
Good question.
My name's Adam Sampson. At the time, I was running a care provider, a large care provider. I now represent optometrists for my sins. So I've moved from the social sciences into proper science, which sort of informs my question. You talked about scientific evidence there. I think it's been defined quite narrowly as being hard science evidence rather than social science evidence. And my question was less about the evidence that was coming down from government, more about the mechanisms for people like me during the pandemic for giving evidence back to government to inform the refinement of their policy. So any ideas and comments from Tracey or the panel about how open government was to receiving evidence as well as giving it.
Really interesting point. I'm going to take one more question from the lady in the middle there.
It's actually a comment rather than a question, so I don't know if you want to have a question instead. No,
go for it if you're brief.
It's Fiona Lethbridge from the Science Media Centre. I just wanted to briefly talk about the thing about where people hear about the information, and just to say that we ran briefings with the scientists who'd done the evidence. So not all of the briefings we ran were Sage commissioned evidence, but some of them were, and those press briefings were for the science journalists who got to spend an hour asking detailed questions of the scientists who had carried out that study. And we recently published some recommendations from our perspective on science and the media based on our experiences during COVID, and one thing we thought could be useful is the kind of separation of communication of scientific evidence from the government department that might have commissioned that. So for example, the REACT study, we ran 20-odd briefings on each of their iterations of their report. That was a science briefing with scientists for the science journalists, not through DH or another government department. And I think we still know from evidence that people tend to have more trust in scientists than in government. So we saw certainly value in journalists, and hopefully through them the public, hearing direct from the scientists who'd done the evidence gathering.
Thank you for that. I know it was an incredibly valuable resource for many. Tracey, I'll let you pick up on any of those.
Just on the first Joe Chataway's point about framework, I don't know if a framework is right. Was it Joe? Did you ask about that, didn't you? Yeah, I don't know if a framework is the right thing to do, but I think anticipating a lot more, because government's all about process at the end of the day, and I think places where we can help people put power, give power to the elbow of those in government who will go through the process and fight for the process to get things out, and would still do so in order to feel enabled to do so during a crisis. That's the thing, because I think everyone sort of took a bit of a back seat and just felt like they couldn't really insist. One place that didn't is the Office for Statistics Regulation and ONS, and I think there's a lot to be learned also in the trust world, the trust domain. There's a lot to be learned from having regular information that is published to a timetable and predictably. I think people say it's very trustworthy because they know it's going to come what may. And maybe there are other ways that we can put rules and frameworks and so on in place that regularize what people do in terms of timetable, in terms of formats and that kind of thing. I'm not sure whether the evidence categorization would actually work. I've been involved in lots of discussions about that sort of thing that in principle sound good and then in practice become really incredibly difficult across such a wide range. But there may be things that could be explored there. And this is a scoping inquiry. This is sort of setting an agenda that we wanted to set with the public's voice and the people's experience to explore exactly those kind of things. And maybe that is one that that we should. I just did want to say something about feeding back in. Yeah, I mean that was the thing. People not only tried to understand the evidence, they actually realised, okay, the government can't be hearing from people like us, and so they started to take it on themselves. Some really brilliant successes. I mean, some people tell the story in here about how they actually end up writing the guidance, and got together. I think Bayes eventually kind of got it together to pull together, groups of well-informed people in sectors to try and come up with things. Transport did really well on that, eventually kind of pulling people in, and then you had kind of other places like wedding celebrants and so on that got together to kind of produce what worked for them and so on. But I do think there's, along the lines of what Greg was saying about, is there a bad or good way of doing it in a crisis rather than on a happy sunny day? I think bypassing government departments needs to be looked at. It seems like, I don't think it was just public that government was struggling to communicate with. I think it was with government. And it almost seemed like just too much headache to kind of involve everyone and they need to be involved because this is a quick decision. But in actual fact, the knowledge that rests in government departments is deep and important. And they've had lots of consultations with stakeholders in all sorts of domains. And I feel that's missing when you want people to change lives so profoundly and to cause so much potential damage, and be so responsible for protecting people. Then you need every bit of information about that and that feedback mechanism as much as possible. I think that's partly why it was missing.
Brilliant. Greg, if I could come to you and pick up Adam's point about social versus hard sciences, I'm just going to throw in another question from our online followers, or I will get criticised for unfairly not including them. And that is just around the kind of persistent rule breaking that's been exposed, and the extent to which that will make it very difficult for the public to trust advice in a future crisis. What will politicians need to do to rebuild that trust?
So I think to Adam's point, I agree with what Tracey said. I don't think there was much permeability from experiences that were being felt on the ground into government and into the scientific advisory bodies as well, I would say. And actually on the point of, as it were, the hard science versus others, our inquiry felt that there was an over-emphasis on modelling and epidemiology, and although, to be fair, Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty wouldn't agree with this, but nevertheless we thought that there was too little, there should have been representation of people with more experience of the social care sector, for example, as a case in point, and from the economic perspective, it was always asserted that the Treasury gave economic advice, and that was combined with the advice of SAGE. But actually, once we got to the point that SAGE minutes were public, we could see what the advice was from the epidemiologists. We never got disclosure of what the economic advice was, and I think that was unsatisfactory. In terms of the people's willingness to abide by rules, and now and in the future. As I said at the beginning, I think there's a dynamic quality to this, and the truth is that people, I think, do have a sense of what was required. So the degree of compliance and seriousness from the outset, I think, surprised people on the upside. People didn't think that we would be, as a society, as compliant with the rules as we turned out to be, with enthusiasm. And I think that represented an appreciation of the degree of the threat. So all of this communication of the data and the evidence, I think people assessed it and thought, this is very serious, we need to follow it. Just looking at the debates in Parliament over the last year, it's been evident, I think, that the ability to do that again in epidemiological circumstances which are different from that first wave is not available. I think you have to make a different choice, and so, you know, God forbid we have to have another circumstance, hopefully not COVID, but something else in which there are draconian restrictions. I think the key dimension here is the perception of the degree of threat to us. I think that is, you know, the determinant of the acceptance of the rules, I think, was, I felt, in pretty strong proportion to the degree of threat that we felt.
Paul, briefly, if you would.
Can I just say to Fiona Fox, I should have said that the Science Media Centre played a heroic role in this, and we had our public sessions, but the briefings that were given to science journalists were of huge value, and I think the prominence of science journalists now, and I dare say the reads and the clicks that they get, I think, also reflects a big appetite for good science journalism. The Science Media Centre was a big part of promoting that.
Thank you for that. It's an important point. Paul, if I could just pick up of those questions with you. I mean, I think there's an interesting point about the certainty attached to evidence and whether businesses would find that helpful, I suppose, in knowing what to make of some of the things coming out from government.
Yeah, and again, it's difficult. Different businesses have different attitudes. We did ask a question, actually, just, you know, out of interest, whether businesses preferred flexibility or prescription. Did they want to be given choice over how to implement some broad principles, or did they want to just be told, here's the rules and you know you can comply? Now, overall, businesses do prefer flexibility, but actually as you go down in size, it becomes a lot more balanced. And with the self-employed community, it's 43% saying I want flexibility, 41% saying I just want certainty. How do you square that circle? Well, I don't think you want to cut off all the flexibility for businesses who would welcome it and might be able to make good choices as a result of it. But I think that's where you need kind of illustrative examples of what compliance looks like. You know, maybe provided by the government, maybe provided by someone who knows that particular sector a bit better. So I think it's nuanced, like all of this.
Brilliant. And Tracey, final word from you. Tell us, you know, how are you going to take this work forward? Sort of what have you taken from the response so far? What should we look out for?
Well, I've got my favourite recommendations, and I do want us to look at the whole question of the transparency standard across government and applying that, and also the idea of having a publicly responsive facility for any big areas of policy, emergency or not emergency, actually. I think we need to look at that as people can suggest trials and think about questions that might actually be, you know, subject to trials as policies are rolled out. Be a fantastic idea, rather than these rather naff pilots that are often done, which are not what we mean. I want to say a nerd thing and then a slightly political thing. A nerd thing is the overemphasis on modelling. I would put it another way, Greg, which is to say there wasn't enough. You know, modelling was narrowly epidemiological and only about reduction in cases and hospital numbers. What about, you know, the optimisation of at what point, with closing the schools, have you had all your best effect? And now you're not really going to, you're going to make, you know, the loss of education worse, but you're not really going to do an awful lot to the pandemic. That was the real problem with modelling. It was just not optimising. And I don't mean we should get into a mega model, but just simply government saying what was it seeking to optimise. would have been a really helpful thing, and also helpful to transparency too, because we could see then where those trade-offs were being made and evidenced. Finally, actually, would say my political point is ultimately it is Parliament that needs to ask these questions. So, you know, we spend a lot of time at Sense About Science telling people that if you want to hold government accountable for the evidence they're using, you go via Parliament, because between elections, that's actually your source of power. You know, it's very important we have a Parliament that is equipped to ask good questions. And I think it was fantastic to see that emerge, but I do think there are some questions also for Parliament and for us to get the public to understand how useful Parliament is at pursuing those questions. I think individual MPs also did really well at bringing them to bear, but I think struggled too at trying to get, you know, those things through in the usual way of getting an answer from DHSE and so on. So I think Parliament is incredibly important in this, and Parliament went through a big kind of self-education process in all of this, and I hope that stays too, because that serves the public well.
Brilliant. Well, that's all we've got time for. Sorry for running 5 minutes over, but do join us for a drink and a natter on the lobby if you can. Thanks very much to everyone for watching online and for the questions you submitted. Thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks very much to a brilliant panel.
Thank you.